Hello and welcome to Great Things with Great Tech, episode 11. My name is Anthony Spiteri, and this podcast is all about highlighting companies doing great things with great tech. And in this episode, I'm really excited to talk to Yves Sandfort, CEO and co-founder at comdivision. Great to have you on.
Thanks for the invite. Always nice to talk about great technologies.
Yeah, so look, just before we get into it and talk about comdivision and all the great technology that you guys have basically built a company over the past 25 years out of, I just want to let you guys know out there that if you love great things with great tech and would like to feature on future episodes, you can click the link in the show notes or go to launch.gtwgt.com and register your interest. The episodes are full for the next 3 or 4 rounds, actually, Yves. So I've got a great pipeline of shows to come. So if you're interested, we're now talking almost about 2021, which is really exciting and scary at the same time. And just as again, if you like the episodes, you can catch all of them on YouTube, GTWGT, and all great podcasting platforms as well. So right, with that all out of the way, Yves, let's get talking about comdivision. Now, just before we get into the history and where you guys came from and a few of the changes along the way, can you just give the guys a bit of an overview as to what comdivision is today and what you guys are doing in the industry?
Yeah, so comdivision, as you said, was founded roughly around 25 years ago. It's next year, April, but we are nearly there. We'll get to that point. We are primarily a professional services company. So we do all kinds of professional services, from architecture over implementation, over consulting services, but also training and enablement. And for the last, I would say 20 years, we focused on everything around VMware. So starting back in the days with vSphere, then when VMware started to come up with tools like VCOps, VRA, and those kinds of things, getting into those. And we always try to be ahead of it and not only do the mainstream stuff, but also the emerging technologies. And nowadays, that means we cover the complete breadth from mobile device management, so the small phone you have in your pocket, up to building public clouds for major service providers all around the globe.
Awesome. And I guess that's the key point as to why I'm talking to you, right? Because I've known you over the years through social medias, through the VMware community, but I've known you to be traveling the world and, effectively enabling these service providers to build really great things on top of VMware technology, right? And that's why, we've talked a lot about vCloud Director, we've talked about all the great technology, ESXi, vSphere, and more recently, Cloud Foundation, lots of great technologies that VMware has allowed you to basically build this consultancy business on and this enablement business. So we'll get into that a little bit later on because I really want to talk about, the ins and outs of that because I'm interested. It's a very different company today that we're talking about versus the other guys that I've had on this show, which are more your traditional infrastructure backup providers. I've had a SaaS company, so you guys are different because you're mostly consultancy now, but that wasn't always the case. So back in 1996, that's when you guys were founded. And not surprisingly, you are the co-founder, but you guys started doing web applications, content management systems, CMSs. Just tell us a little bit about that first few years there.
So back in those days, I was one of the early guys dealing with internet in Germany anyway, so more or less out of the backyard. And then we started to look into web applications or web design initially. And out of the web design idea came the concept of we need to make this more simplistic for customers so that they can manage it themselves. So the term content management wasn't really there back then. And I remember we had the first big public sector customer, and we explained them, it's like all your web pages are coming out of a database. And they went, it's like, yeah. So what? That's never going to fly. And I always come back to the original contract manuals because I still have them in my office, and they had something in there where it says it's like the project is successful if a web page is loaded within 30 seconds and the search query is returned within 5 minutes, which is like, really try to get anywhere with that today. But
that must have been a really big web page at 30 seconds back then, geez.
That was really an interesting time, and we never really sold the software. So it was always a subscription-based solution, even though back then subscription-based was really an exception business. We didn't have terms like SaaS, etc.
Yeah.
And we initially started on Linux and Unix systems in the backend, but then moved into a VMware-based platform for scalability. So we early on had things like automatically scaling web servers based on virtual machines, which we would actually roll out and just deploy as needed. So some of the things which nowadays are the common scenario, we started to build them and operate them back then. And that was also where VMware more or less came to us and said, it's like, can you actually help us with highly specialized consulting, architecture, and also enablement for some of our partners?
Because you guys basically, I mean, that was from 1996. So if we talk about the virtualization, that was in, I'm going to say roughly 2005, 2006, when you probably started getting into that. So between that, I mean, what was happening kind of around the .com? The .com bubble and the burst is something that I've talked about on the show with a few customers, right, who are a bit older and established. And the story is all the same, but how did you guys find it around that time? What were you offering back then around the 2000, 2001 mark before you got into virtualization?
The interesting part is that was exactly the .com bubble, and we had 9/11, and all of these things actually happened around that same time period. And that was even the most crazy part, because everybody else was trying to get rid of their companies, and we were the only ones who basically bought the company back from our former investor, who actually invested and helped get the funding together. And there we were, and actually said, it's like, we are going to do a complete buyout and take it back back then together with the other founder. And that was kind of crazy. I mean, that was still in the beginning of the bubble, but they were happy to get out of it. And we said, it's like, we are pretty confident that we can keep it up and running, because we had a solid customer base. The market was still there. No one was ever thinking that web or anything like that would go away. So that worked out pretty well. We had to transition the business like you have to do every couple of years. And we refocused a bit more on instead of large enterprise customers, more on consumer customer, or not consumer, but smaller customers, and grew from just a handful of customers or a few hundred customers, I think, to 13 or 15,000 customers.
Wow, that's huge growth. And that was on the back of, in 2003, you separated, from what I read, the hosting business and consulting business were separated. So the hosting business was under one side and growing rapidly. And then that's when you kind of started that consultancy business as well. And you did that for a few years. And then I think in about 2007 is when you started trading or doing work in the US. Is that about right? So how did you move from being Germany-based, being in that region, I think also Switzerland and a few other countries out there, how did you break into the States as a European company?
Breaking into the States actually came by the point, because I was investing in a few startups in the Bay Area. So that was one of the areas. So I had a few friends who created startups over there. So I was visiting the area quite a few times, and that actually also opened up, at least to a certain degree, the relationships to VMware and a few other larger companies. And out of that, the whole story evolved on delivering services over there. And although doing business in the US is still quite different than what we do in Europe, it's, as of today, is still making up more than 50% of our revenue stream.
That's great. So you started there. You're in the States now. You obviously got good contacts with VMware, and then in 2009, that's when you were approached by VMware to take more of an active role in this education thing, right? Because I guess still in 2009, virtualization was not, it was mainstream, but it wasn't sort of well known. I see 2009-8 as the time when it really grew, the community started. And from a hosting perspective, infrastructure as a service and all that kind of stuff as well, there were people that said, we want to be doing this, but we don't know how to do it. So I'm guessing that's where you came in with all of your previous experience around VMware. So do you just want to talk a little bit about that?
So yeah, back then that was exactly the point where VMware approached us, whether we could actually provide training and consultancy. And then more or less it kind of exploded by itself, because out of the, hey, can you teach vSphere and a few other things, came the point that VMware started to get into the management area. So that was also the time where VCOps and then later on VCAC, or now VRA, came into play. And that we were early on in these technologies. And so it was more like, I think it was VMworld Copenhagen or something like that, where we had where we met up with several executives from VMware and talked about it's like how to bring these products to market. And it was, I think, a bit of a fun game in the initial things, where we said, it's like, yeah, we have already training for our customers because you didn't build anything as VMware. And so they turned around, it's like, what do you mean with you have that? And we said, it's like, yeah, we needed to build something because we have customers who are using it. So, and that actually started off in us flying with a complete team into Palo Alto a few days later, and actually meeting with a lot of people. And that was still Paul Moritz back then within VMware, and Ramin, who now runs Sumo Logic, was one of the big points. And I remember we had a week full of meetings discussing all the different bits and pieces we would need together with VMware to build a strong partner ecosystem around this. And out of that, that initially we were thinking is we just sell our training materials. And the end of the week was Ramin together with Paul back then saying, it's like, can you do all of this for us? And we were, it's like, what do you mean with all of this? It's like, yeah, everything from end to beginning. We don't have any, we can't currently build this. And so that brought us into that scenario. And from there on, we again and again came into play with different scenarios, helping VMware get emerging technologies into market, especially because VMware is also a larger customer, a larger company, and we have done that with other vendors as well. As very often when these larger companies acquire a startup, the challenge is there is structure and process in the large company, and then you have the startup on the other side, which is like they have one guy who is actually training everybody. He has 5 slides and does a 3 days training out of 5 slides, and that absolutely doesn't scale. So that's where we come in and actually absorbing all the information, taking it into a repeatable class, and then actually handing it over into the normal education stream. And that's what we have been doing for several products over the years. But we also,
I think as well at that point you kind of look at it and you go, it was ripe for you guys, because if you look at what VMware had acquired, I mean, obviously they started out with ESXi, vCenter, kind of grew from there. But then around that time is when they started to really acquire companies, right? And if you look at all the products that you talked about, VROPS, VRAR, VCAC, Dynamic Ops, vCloud Director, even to a certain extent with Lab Manager, there are all these disparate technologies, great technologies, right? But they were very disparate at the time. And to put them all together, I mean, obviously I was working in that industry as well. And sometimes to put all those things together to make them cohesive, to make them work together to deliver the service that you want, you need someone to guide you, not only from the point of view of the education and the enablement, but also from the design aspect. I'm guessing that's where you guys basically came in and effectively rocked it for VMware, did it really well, and continued that engagement. Is that a fair statement in terms of that acquisition timeframe that we were in?
That was definitely, it worked well for both of us. So we were just not rebuilding, but we were refocusing our business more around VMware. VMware was looking for someone who really had, on one hand, the partner hat on, but on the other hand, also the customer and everybody else in mind, and also a strong background. And so it all came together because I think that's just the point in time where VMware and comdivision actually were at the same spot in the correct time, and that actually made it work.
Yeah, and then obviously we're talking about 2009-10 timeframe. 2013 roughly is when Nicira got acquired, and I still think that was one of VMware's greatest acquisitions in terms of, really propelled them to where they are today. I think anyway, Nicira. So that which turned into NSX. So now that you've got all these building blocks together for the service providers and I guess other enterprises that you guys kind of service. But I'm interested in, because obviously a lot of my focus is around service providers as well. I'm interested in how you would take an approach to go into a service provider and get them to deliver a service built on these great technologies for themselves to deliver great technology. So what's your go-to philosophy in terms of talking to providers and then delivering the content, delivering the education, and helping them succeed?
So for us, it's always going back to the drawing board, starting with business requirements. And that is what a lot of people always tend to forget. They try to sell products and not even solutions, but they don't look into what is the customer base of the service provider. So one of the first things we always do is go back and even talk to their salespeople. What are you selling to your customers? Because in the end, it doesn't help us if we build a great cloud, but they don't have any clue or any customers to sell it to. So the first thing is always, it's like, what's your current focus area? What's your next focus area? How do you want to build business around it? And that makes it easier. Kind of to a certain degree, what VMware talks in different other scenarios as well at the moment. It's a platform which is built for the actual need, and not the actual need is bolted onto a product in the end, because that's what we see too often. So it's all around business requirements. It's also around building a solid design and foundation and include education services into it. So there are, for example, rules we have, at least for larger engagements, where we tell the service providers, this is the education plan your people have to go through. If you don't follow it, we will put the project on hold, because we can't enable you to get the product into service anymore. And also when we do, and we do everything. We have done service providers where we have just implemented one specific point solution, but we also just this year did a service provider back-to-back from physical hardware implementation up to the point of bringing their first customers online.
Okay, cool.
And that scenario is quite different, and that included everything, the complete VMware stack. It included Veeam as a backup solution, and we are now discussing adding Amazon services and other things into this whole game. But that's the point, and that also means we are not leaving them by the point in time like, hey, here is your working cloud, go. Where we say it's like, this is never going to fly. We have done that in the past, but then that ends up in a scenario that the service provider half a year later still doesn't have any customer on it. So we take them and actually help their operations team to onboard the first few customers, kind of white label their services together. So it's typically the first task, we do it, they shadow us. Second one is we do it together. Third one is then they do it and we are just there as a shadow. And ideally then we can step out of it and they can onboard customers by themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting actually, because I know personally, I've dealt with, obviously through my role, I deal with providers in all over the world, right? And I find in different regions there's a different appetite for building and then running and operating your own cloud from the start. And then there's a lot that I find which basically want to do everything hand off and have everything done for them and then operate afterwards. But I think what you're doing is you're bridging that gap, because I think, like you said, there's a danger in those providers who get it all built for them and then say, here you go, beautiful, it's all working, okay? The first time they have a massive issue without the understanding of the underlying technology, they're going to be in trouble. And who are they going to call? I mean, that's not a primarily focus, which I think you guys do. So I see that as being quite interesting. So, but I also understand why you guys do what you do, because it was traditionally hard to put all those pieces together, architect it, make sure it ran, and then obviously operationally hand it over. What's your thoughts today, though? I mean, there's a few more things to chat about in terms of customers and the history. But while we're on this tangent, you look at something like VMware Cloud Foundation today, which effectively has one very big ISO. You run it, it goes through a set of scripted installs, and it effectively deploys this SDDC almost directly into a data center, right? How do you see that, and how has that impacted what you guys do as well? Because it's different, isn't it? It's like it's less bits to put together, but there's still the same componentry. So I'm interested in that.
It's in the end, when I look at the majority of our projects, the biggest part out of it is not necessarily the install piece. So yes, VCF is going to potentially eat up a bit of the consulting time we have, But on one hand, looking at our backlog, and on the other hand, to be honest, it's not the most fun job to install 500 ESXi hosts and
No.
50 vSpheres and stuff like that. If we get automation into that, that's perfect. That's also why we were involved in things like Cloud Provider Pod to build an automatic automation platform and things like that.
Yeah.
And because everybody understands that this is necessary. And you can also see when you look at the different technologies and approaches VMware takes there, they even don't yet know, I think, what's the perfect solution for it, because they have VCF, they had auto deploy, they had Cloud Provider Pod, there were other solutions for automatic deployment. In reality, VMC uses a different approach. So everybody is still trying to figure out how to solve this. But reality is, let's face it, I think in 5 years' time latest, if not even earlier, you will basically just go to your reseller or distributor or whatever else and order, I need a rack of that amount of compute power and everything else. And you get it all racked and stacked and finished, delivered to your door. Or it might not even get delivered because it directly ends up in a co-location space or anything else. Infrastructure will be consumed in a different way.
It becomes completely commoditized, doesn't it? And that's where it's leading. It's the work that we would have been doing, or I would have been doing, and other people that were hands-on in engineering and architecting, it's fundamentally shifted because of things like infrastructure as code, because of the way that the technologies that were so distributed and so not cohesive, they've all come together to a certain extent. Underpinned by great technology like the networking, the virtual networking with NSX, vCloud Director, which is that cloud management stack. You've got the automation and procurement piece, which is VROPS, or that's the monitoring piece. It just all comes together really nicely. And now, oh, by the way, it's also easier to deploy. But that's where I think the next step comes in for you guys, right? And we were talking about this earlier, you look at it now and it's more about SD-WAN, it's more about VMC, it's about intrinsic security. Those are the sort of, they're buzzwords, a lot of them, but just tell us how that's going to shape what you guys do.
We see that actually when we look at it, we all started somewhere, and then we became more or less software defined with vSphere. So we actually took compute out of the physical equation. Then after we had compute, we looked at networking and storage. If you look at the VMware scope, so we had NSX, vSAN, and stuff like that. But in most cases, that was very siloed still on the data center. The new approach we have to deal with nowadays is with things like Carbon Black from a security perspective, or VeloCloud from an SD-WAN perspective, we take this software defined even more outside of the data center. And especially this year has changed a lot of it anyway. So people are working from home. All of a sudden, I need to stretch my data center to the home. I need to provide a completely different set of access technologies. All of that combined with, and that's where you see where companies really are in the legacy mode. They still try to get every employee to feed their data from their home office back through the internet into the main office, and then from there into Office 365.
Yes, lots of paths to be intercepted. Let's just say that, and accessed.
And that also changes security and everything else. So there are quite a few things which still need to be solved, and not all of it what we have now is perfect. But we are getting to the point that software-defined networking with things like VeloCloud actually is expanded up until the home office. When you see the newest announcements from VMworld with the SASE services, where the customer themselves or the enterprise doesn't have to build up a massive VPN infrastructure anymore.
It's crazy.
They can leverage AWS-backed data centers all around the globe and really provide VPN access at the doorstep of every employee. And this was something which was formerly only possible for very large enterprises.
Yes.
And all of this cloud enables that for everyone.
So you're saying that almost, to a certain extent, when we've talked about the commoditization of the compute, the storage, of the networking, and now that the WAN is being commoditized as well, where it becomes a very easy thing to install and to have and to consume. So, however, there's still need people like you guys to basically be able to consult around that, to make the customers understand what they're doing and the providers understand how to provide it as well. That's quite interesting. Just so yeah, to talk about VMware Cloud as well and how that's changed what you guys do. VMware have gone very heavy on that as a technology. A lot of the messaging last week was around that, especially around a DR, disaster recovery, on-demand recovery. I mean, that's something I've been talking about for the last couple of years. How has that changed the narrative? Because prior to that, we were talking about maybe moving workloads to the hyperscale public cloud. So VMware saw an opportunity to still capture the virtualization market, but make it hyperscale enabled. So how has that impacted you, and has it impacted the market?
I think it's two different scenarios. So the whole VMC on AWS story worked pretty well in the US. It still had its challenges in Europe.
Right.
We slowly now see more and more customers jump onto it.
Yes.
But it's very often not primary workload. It's very often disaster recovery pieces, etc. So the VMware story makes sense to look more on disaster recovery as a service, because that's also a point where customers can easily save a lot of money. And when we look at it, is why do you run 2 data centers if you only need 1?
Yeah.
If the second one is only there for an afterthought and in case of a disaster. What I, however, always explain to customers is be very, very careful with this approach, because what we also learned this year is the cloud doesn't scale endlessly.
Oh, yes. Let me just think about that. So did Azure ran out of compute in the UK, from memory? I think that was one, and stories like that. So yeah, you're right. It's not endlessly scalable.
So if we have a disaster scenario, a wider disaster scenario, and we could just actually play this whole game around the Bay Area, for example, is like, how much wildfires do they have? Don't even need to think about an earthquake. If the wildfires hit any of the areas where the major data centers are, have fun if all of these massive data centers, and they are not small over there,
no.
Have to fail over to somewhere else, then you will run out of capacity. So it's always, even though we have these new cloud DR technologies, we need to think about how that works. The point, however, it makes perfect sense, because it's an easy step for customers to get into the cloud, because they can just move their backups and something else into the cloud. And then it's like, oh, we have it running there. We could actually test drive it. It's a bit like getting into virtualization. In the early days, virtualization, we did use virtualization for development systems and sometimes testing backup and DR solutions.
Yes.
And it's more or less the same approach now, that because people still don't necessarily feel comfortable to put their critical workloads into the cloud, or one of the scenarios I hear again and again in the commercial space is like, we will move into the cloud once we have completed this SAP migration project and this project, and then we are going to move into the cloud. Where you go, it's like, yeah, that's another 10 years. Even though it's like,
people are still on Lotus Notes, right? Like that's a big thing still. People still are on Lotus Notes.
Don't make fun of that. We have customers who still.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, it's crazy. I was being serious. It's mental to think, but that's the reality of this industry. Not everyone moves at light speed at Silicon Valley, cloud native speed. People are slow. Enterprises are slow, and everyone needs to be aware of that.
And that's also where VMware Cloud on AWS and similar services like the new VMware on Azure or the Google Cloud.
Yeah, it's on everything, yeah.
It's all three of them. We always talk about VMware Cloud on AWS, and that's because it's operated by VMware. The others are operated by the other ones. But the point here is that now more and more people actually get to know these services, get to understand them, and it becomes an opening door, because they are building cloud native applications which sit in the cloud, and then figure out, damn, everything else is still sitting on premises.
Yeah.
So how do I link that?
Let's bring it together. Yeah.
And when I look at the current VMware Cloud on AWS projects we currently have in our pipeline, to be realistic, 3 or 4 out of them are failed lift and shift projects where companies wanted to move to AWS native and then figured out that 80% of their workloads is still legacy workload and is not going to be a cloud native application within the next few years. So that's where tools like VMware Cloud on AWS come in handy. And I spoke to a major venture capital company early this year, where we had a discussion with them around these types of stories. And they said, it's like, so I don't need to have my customers or their tenants to do lift and shift to bring everything into the cloud. And I said, it's like, no, in theory, you can just run the same they have in their data center and just move it into the cloud.
Yep.
And I think that's, with all, even when I look at what we currently discussed during VMworld or what Pat and everybody else presented, I think that's the big part out of the message, which still hasn't come across to a lot of, let's say, business owners, is like, whatever you do currently in your data center, we can one-on-one take it and move it into the cloud without changes.
Yes.
It's that simple.
And it is that simple as well. Yeah. So just
every time I demo that with HCX or something like that.
That's exactly right. So just tell me a little bit about your thoughts on intrinsic security. That to me is intrinsic security is a word that's popped up very prominently over the past sort of 3 to 6 months. And maybe it's another buzzword, but you mentioned carbon black before. Just talk a little bit about what you think that is and how it's going to impact, and also what you guys do around intrinsic security, because let's dive into the technology under that buzz.
So when we look at intrinsic security, and no matter how you want to call it, there are a bunch of buzzwords out there at the moment. I think it's next generation intrusion detection, antivirus, however we want to call that. But people don't want to use next generation as a term anymore. But in the end, it's all about the point that we, and what VMware tries here is to bring to life something which has been promised for many, many years by all the other security vendors. It's one security solution by one vendor, which solves at least the majority of your cases. When we look at most companies, it's still over 25 applications, even in small and medium-sized businesses, which they have for security solutions, from firewall appliances over intrusion detection, over antivirus, very often antivirus different on server and cloud and everything else. And that's where VMware tries to get a handle on it. And Carbon Black is just one building block out of it, but it's the most important building block out of it, because it takes complete cloud approach for security and self-learning and self-healing infrastructure. So it's much more about understanding. And when you look at VMware's history, tools like VCOps, understanding what is normal and what is an abnormal behavior. And Carbon Black basically plays into the same scenario again. It's like, what is the normal behavior of a knowledge worker or something else versus what's an abnormal behavior, and then change the antivirus patterns and everything else around it based on that. Because if we currently take the complete antivirus stack and everything and mold it onto a computer, you basically lose up to 30 or 40% of the performance.
I remember doing that myself. I remember trying to implement even inline AV, and it just caused all sorts of problems on the hypervisor. So to do it cloud-based, have all the processing off the hypervisor and off the actual platform is a very smart move. And the intrinsic part is obviously the deep part of it in terms of what it's doing. That's really cool. I just wanted to touch, because we could talk for hours and have great conversations around this, right? I really wanted to get in, just to finish off, into what you guys are doing, now to basically set yourself up for this next wave of multi and hybrid cloud, right? As much of a buzzword as that is, but the reality is we're moving into more cloud native situations. Kubernetes has been getting up there in big. AWS, Azure, Google Cloud. So the one question I haven't asked in terms of from a company perspective, actually, now that I just remember, how big are you guys now? So what's the makeup of the company? How many people are in the company?
We have roughly around 20 architects now on the main team, and that's really our focus. Is even though we do a lot of consultancy, a lot of us are architects by heart, and that's what we focus on, and that's our main area. We also don't really have that much of a dedicated sales team. We have 1 or 2 people who focus on that area, but we would really see this more like customer relationship managers, because in reality, we are not really doing anything like cold calls or anything like that. The point is, yes, we are looking for more people. We are planning to expand more, especially in the future, expanding more in the US. As we currently still operate, as I said in the beginning, over 50% of our revenue comes from the US, whereas majority of our resources are sitting in Europe. And, on the other hand, US is far more flexible with things like remote working, etc.
I was going to say, that in this day and age where we're at with the COVID and whatnot, it's a little bit interesting. But so all those 20 architects that you've got now, and they do all the enablement and they do the consultancy and the enablement. obviously you want to be upskilling them. So you want to be upskilling them in what's new and what's going to be, what you think is going to be big in the next 2 to 3 years, because that's what you're going to base your business on, your revenue coming in. So what have you put your bets on over the next 2 to 3 years?
So on one side, we definitely look at all the emerging technologies. So things like we build up people more on the networking side, because that's becoming more and more relevant again. People are just adopting NSXT, VeloCloud, things like that. Security. One of our team members even goes back to university now and goes to study a few areas, because that's the other new normal part. If someone decides that they want to actually really learn it deeply, there are additional requirements for that. And the other part is clearly looking into public clouds. So we have one team under myself who which focuses primarily around AWS services. So we are on the radar and working with AWS intensively to up our partner level over the next few months pretty rapidly. There is another colleague who does exactly the same on the Azure side, because we see different workload scenarios and different needs there. Google is also on our list, but again, we can't attack all of them at the same point in time.
Yeah, you've got to pick and choose your battles.
And the other thing is clearly cloud native, Kubernetes, etc. So we definitely need to get our head around this. It's going to be the next wave. Although it's still going to run on a hypervisor or something similar, it is technology we need to work with. And that's everyone who currently works in the virtualization space and doesn't accept the phase that the definition, what he currently defines as a virtual machine in the future, will be a Kubernetes definition. Has done something wrong. And because that's the next step. We will still have legacy virtual machines. We will still have physical machines. We will still have all of that. There is a reason why even Microsoft, AWS, and everybody offer bare metal systems, because they are not going to go away. But we will also have, moving forward, more and more of these new workloads. So for us at the moment, it's really a bit more of diversity, where we have been VMware only in the past. We are far more focused on looking into these additional public clouds. But also getting our head around building the infrastructure around security and other things in the backend.
That's awesome. Yeah, that's cool. I mean, I think, like I said, I mean, we chatted earlier, and I think the great thing about comdivision that I wanted you on the show was because, you know, you're different to, again, the people that I've had before, the companies where you're enabling other companies to do great things with great technology, but you need to be aware of that great technology as well, to impart the knowledge, to impart the architecture, to impart the ongoing maintenance, and you've got to be up and about. And you're right, we are definitely in this transitional period, but, you know, anyone who hasn't wrapped their heads around the new wave, Kubernetes, whatnot, don't worry so much. I think there's still time, like we all know, but you have to be thinking that, right? It's a mad scramble. It's a bit of FOMO happening massively, but the reality is it is coming, and we're not going to lose what we've worked on with regards to virtualization with the physical sense, like you said, but we're going to be treating those differently. They're going to be commoditized, and then everything else that you guys are working on, focusing on, becomes that front of mind technology stack that is now what you actually deliver. So yeah, I think it's pretty cool and really cool story. I appreciate you being on. It's been great. Like I said, we can always talk longer. If this show was 2 or 3 hours, we could talk for 2 or 3 hours. We have so much to say, but we've got to wrap it up. I'm just going to put a bit of a shout out here. We'll put up some show notes for you guys. So all about comdivision, we'll put that up on the show notes page. All the history, all the websites, we'll get that up and running. If you aren't subscribed to GTWGT, please click on the link below or in your favorite podcast platform. And with that, we'd like to thank Yves and comdivision, and we will see you next time. Thank you. Thanks, Yves.
Thank you, Anthony, for having me. Goodbye.